Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Juliet Lawton of the Business Lincolnshire events team. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on the future of green construction in Greater Lincolnshire, brought to you jointly by Team Lincolnshire and Business Lincolnshire. This is the fourth in a series of webinars delivered by Team Lincolnshire to provide support for businesses during these challenging times. Business Lincolnshire also have a host of webinars that you can access through their website. We are delighted to be joined by the leader of North East Stephen District Council and the chair of the LEP today, along with members of Team Lincolnshire. Team Lincolnshire is an initiative that brings the public and private sector together to promote Greater Lincolnshire as a place to live, work and invest. Now in its third year, it's one of the fastest growing ambassador programmes in the UK, with over 100 members from a diverse range of sectors. Team Lincolnshire is a powerful and influential group with a key focus on championing the region. They want to improve the environment for businesses to grow, to attract new investment and to drive forward the economy of Greater Lincolnshire. If you're interested in joining or would like to find out more information, please visit the Team Lincolnshire website. That's www.teamlincolnshire.com. Alternatively, look out for us on Twitter at Team Links, or LinkedIn, where we are pushing forward with our Team Lincolnshire Cares campaign to show just how much Team Lincolnshire is supporting each other and the wider community during COVID-19 and beyond. The Business Lincolnshire Growth Hub wants to help as many businesses across Greater Lincolnshire as possible during these uncertain times too. We are continuing to share the latest updates and advice as we receive it, to make sure every business is aware of the potential funding, learning opportunities and tailored support that is on offer. We're also keen to share local business innovations or successes. So if you have an inspiring story to tell, please do get in touch. For the latest news and guidance for businesses on this continuously evolving situation, please visit our website, which is www.businesslincolnshire.com. Should you wish to speak to an advisor, please email businesslincolnshire@lincolnshire.uk. So today's topic is pertinent to building a green and resilient recovery from COVID-19. It's a vast subject and there'll be a lot of information to digest in today's session, as well as bringing an opportunity to open up discussion for public and private sector organisations to work together. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Vanessa Strange of Lincolnshire County Council, who will provide an overview of where Greater Lincolnshire is now and what the sustainable construction aspirations are for the county. This will be followed by insights into the barriers to delivering green construction and how the industry can redesign to bring out the opportunities using technology and innovation from Tom Jarman of Low Carbon Journey. And then finally, Tim Clement of Morgan Sindall will provide a case study where they worked on a recent project delivered for the University of Nottingham, and this was to illustrate how a zero carbon agenda is realised in practice and what the experience has taught them in terms of achieving low carbon outcomes on future projects. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for today's webinar. That's Vanessa. Vanessa heads up infrastructure investment at Lincolnshire County Council. It combines three distinct but complementary teams: spatial planning, funding infrastructure and investment, and transport and growth. The Infrastructure Investment Service is tasked with understanding and articulating the challenges and opportunities of the county, as well as bringing forward funding in response. It works at a local, regional and national level to shape the agenda and create changes to both national policy direction, but also to funding arrangements. Over to you, Vanessa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone will be able to see my screen now as well. I would really like to say thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all this afternoon. It's so wonderful to be able to kick off this afternoon's presentations and give an overview from the public sector perspective of what's a really exciting agenda at this point in time. It's great to see so many Team Lincolnshire members on the call as well, able to share with you a public sector lens perhaps, but many of you will be partners either from the One Public Estate perspective, or maybe are delivering a project with public sector, or indeed perhaps you're experiencing the impact of the public sector as a developer, or indeed just a member of the community. Bear with me. So 3 topics that I just wanted to touch on today, and it is just a brief overview, but really about a shifting policy context for ourselves, the shaping of the public estate, and also the wider place agenda. So firstly, just touch on policy and politics. Many of you will be aware that the green agenda has really come to the fore in recent years and months, and that has had an impact in Lincolnshire as anywhere else. Our response has been from Lincolnshire County Council to be very clear that we have an aspiration to become carbon neutral by 2050 or sooner if practicable. And across the public sector estate, other local authorities have responded with their own targets that will indeed meet that national and international targets, both around carbon zero, but also thinking about how we reduce the increase in global temperatures as well. So that then has an impact in the work that we do. So my team are particularly involved with local planning authorities, district councils, in shaping local plans. And as we move forward with those conversations, very much about how do we enable a more carbon neutral agenda in terms of housing and development. Some really interesting research work going on in that area at the moment to see what contribution we can make to that wider agenda. From the County Council's perspective, we are developing a Green Master Plan currently, which sets out very much how we will achieve our 2050 target, recognising that our estate is part of that. And by our estate, I mean everything from the buildings we function in through to our county farms, which we own as well. So it's a very broad piece of work, as well as how we function as a business. And taking into account the impacts of COVID and the ways that we've been working differently. So there is a whole stream of work looking at how the workforce operates. And of course, that will impact on the buildings that we need going forward in the future. Finally, public sector in terms of delivering those national targets, just worth emphasising, as everybody is aware, the need for all of us to contribute to that. So in terms of reshaping the public estate, historically we've done a huge amount of work in terms of things like carbon management plans, in looking at the buildings that we use and really targeting energy efficiency measures, carbon focus around that. I thought I'd share with you some figures which are maybe quite challenging for people to see if they're on a small screen, but you can look at those in detail afterwards. And it's just a snapshot of one piece of work that we've done recently. And colleagues in One Public Estate have worked to deliver the Blue Light project in Lincoln, bringing together our emergency services. And I think it's just a really useful example, and many people will have done something similar really in recent years, where thinking about the design of the building at quite an early stage has helped us realise both carbon savings, so a 41% reduction in carbon emissions, but also in terms of energy costs. And we're always mindful of both of those things in terms of the public purse as well. So as we become increasingly informed about what best practice looks like, I think there'll be even bigger impacts in terms of public estate. We also have a role in developing things like workspaces, and other projects whereby we need to think about how can we be a leading example in this arena. And finally, I was just going to touch on the place agenda and our role within that. I think one of the key things that we do as Highways Authority in particular is development management, and thinking about how we respond to planning developments and how we can work with developers to create much greener spaces, both in terms of the buildings themselves, but also the sites on which they sit. So I think historically that's sort of come forward as SUDS and flooding agenda, but actually it can have a much wider impact as well. And that can really be of benefit to all of Lincolnshire. I think I was challenged the other day by somebody who said that all growth was necessarily bad and harmful, while recognising the fact that they just wanted a few houses in their village. And I'm sure we all come across those kind of challenges in the discussions that we have. I think by the end of the conversation, the person in question and I both came to a mutual understanding that it was about finding the best place for Lincolnshire people to live, and that was about new developments as well. So in terms of the County Council, we're not here saying that we have all of the answers, but I'm really excited to be part of the conversation with all of you this afternoon. I'd really welcome people to get in touch with me outside of this meeting as well to continue those conversations. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Vanessa. I'm just looking to see, have we got any questions that are coming from that first section, David, or should we move on to Tom?
No, thank you very much, everybody, for having me today. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is David Knight. I work with Business Lincolnshire as a Resource Efficiency Advisor, and it's great to be part of the webinar today. Yeah, we have had some questions come through. So I'll start with the first one that's come through. So the question is, did you measure the carbon cost and carbon payback timescale of the build out of the Blue Light project?
So yes, that is work that we've done in terms of that initial spec, yes, and it very much helps us in terms of the business case to understand that investment, which has been really important to us. I'd be happy to speak to people outside of the meeting if they'd like some more detail on that as well.
Great, thank you. Another question's come in. So Vanessa, when do you foresee that all new developments will incorporate renewable technology?
Really interesting question. So I think there's such a wide breadth to that whole agenda, isn't it? So one of the pieces of work that I'm involved in at the moment, the next local transport plan development, and how do we contribute to the decarbonisation agenda in terms of movement and electric vehicles, and how can we work with our planning authorities. I think we all have some key dates, don't we, in terms of decarbonisation to work towards. There's a bit of balance to be had in terms of the viability conversation, and I think as things become much more popular, that's an easier conversation to be had. But just going back to the kind of role of development management, I think some of the work that they've been doing is about if we can be involved at an early enough stage, or if this agenda can be involved at an early stage, we can really influence developments to be much more focused on the environment as a whole, and not necessarily much higher cost, which is obviously important to from a development perspective. I'm not sure I'm pinning myself down to a date there, but yeah, I think we'll see a big shift in the next 5 years, I'd say.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So just going through this, thank you very much. So what role does construction play in decarbonising heating systems and transport systems in terms of charging facilities?
So I suppose for me, the role is thinking about where people, it's a slightly obvious statement, but as things evolve, where are we going to do that charging? Is it going to be about destination charging? Are we going to have facilities for people to charge in city centres and towns, or are people going to be happy to just sort of charge overnight? And at the moment it feels like a blend of the two, but as battery technology evolves, then that could change fairly rapidly. It's also about working with our DNOs to make sure that we've got good capacity and grid connections. But I think that connection, it's the working with both tiers of authorities, isn't it? So getting it, if we get it right, then we get it a kind of one public estate voice as well in terms of conversations with developers, I think.
Okay, brilliant. We do have quite a few questions coming through, so what I'll do is I'll ask one more question for now, and then we'll save the rest of the questions to later on. So for those of you who put questions through, if we don't answer now, we do have a Q&A session towards the end, so we'll certainly come back and address as much as we can. But it's certainly one, it's actually come through a couple of questions. So just, I guess, in summary, in terms of policy and aspiration to better the minimum requirements under Part L of the building regulations, and not just meet them, is there opportunity, is there aspiration within the council, within Lincolnshire, to look at housing development, for example, by looking at passive house?
Yes, so I suppose there's sort of two elements to my response in this. So I think there's a real interest in terms of housing that might come forward that developed by the public sector. But then there's also conversations that are referred to local plans. For example, Central Lincolnshire local plan, which is North Castile and West Lindsey, the city and county working together, are very interested at the moment about how far can we drive this agenda, and we genuinely are at the sort of cutting edge of local authorities in the research that we're doing at the moment. I appreciate the need to also lobby at a national level in terms of building regulations and asks, and there are lots of complexities around this in terms of planning white paper, etc., which could be a whole nother webinar. I think there's almost a twin track approach, isn't there? There's the conversations at national level about what good should look like, and also what we are able to deliver locally.
Okay, brilliant. And so just going through, I've noticed that someone's raised their hands in terms of actually wanting to ask a question directly. So again, I appreciate we'll move on. We'll do this as the last question, if we can, please. So I think Dawn Smith, you've raised your hand. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Oh, sorry, I think I've hit it by accident myself.
Oh,
sorry.
did you? That's okay, no worries. Yeah, no, okay, that's fine. Brilliant. Okay, well, as I said, we'll come back. There are definitely some more questions that have come through. We'll come back to you later on, but just to keep going with the webinar to make sure that we keep on time as much as possible. I'll just say thank you very much, Vanessa, for that, and thank you for your questions. We'll come back to address some more later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We shall now move on to our next presenter, who is Tom Jarman, and he should be able to share his screen with us now.
Hello there, everyone. Good afternoon. I've just, from my end, I've shared my screen. Can everybody see that first slide?
We can see the holding slide, Tom, yeah.
Sorry, the title slide, can you see
yeah,
that?
See the slide, yeah.
Okay,
That's
can
correct.
you can see my slide now, can you, with the picture and as the background and what have you?
Yes, Tom, that's fine. You're all ready to go. Thank you.
Right, well, thanks very much for asking me to come to the webinar. I think it's a really interesting question, and my struggle about this wasn't so much about the technology, it was more about defining ambition. So I've really enjoyed preparing for this, so let's go through it and hopefully you'll get something out of it as well. I want to start off with some context. So I came across this recently, Earth Overshoot Day, which marks the day when we're using more resources as a global population than the Earth can renew. This year, globally, the date was the 22nd of August, but actually the UK's date is much earlier. So as of about mid-May every year, we as a nation are using more resources than the Earth can feasibly provide. This is another interesting graphic as well. I don't know if people have seen this one. The stripes represent the world's average temperature every year since the mid-19th century. So you can see the very, very dramatic shift as we come up to the time we are now in terms of those average temperatures. And I thought this one might be of interest as well, especially with people from the public sector on the call, because a lot of things focus on the ecological ceiling, how we're using too many resources. But actually local authorities and LEPs and others have a social role as well. And the inside of this graphic covers the shortfall in terms of the social side of our societies. So far, so alarming. Let's take a step away from that now to look a bit more at the role of construction within that context. I don't know if you're aware of this document published in 2013, Construction 2025. So construction accounts for about 6.5% of GDP. One of the interesting things about this document is it set 4 quite clear high-level targets. You'll notice the one there about emissions, a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment by 50%. That was a target back in 2013, and it still remains very much a target with not a huge amount of progress made. The latest figures in terms of construction and the impact of construction are from 2018. Accounts for about £113 billion worth of annual spend. There's nearly 326,000 companies and this enormous workforce of 1.36 million. So construction is very significant within carbon emissions for our country. The UK GBC have got some more figures on that. The built environment includes accounts for about 40% of the UK's total carbon footprint. Someone mentioned heating earlier. Heating is about 25% of that 40%, so quite a significant proportion. And most of our existing buildings will still be standing in 2050, which is a concern for the much older ones because they consume much more heat. And there's also interesting work from the Committee on Climate Change, which again is more specific about energy use in homes and the connection with emissions and the concern around emissions reduction stalling. You may not be aware of steel and cement production. An enormous amount of steel and cement are produced every year, accounting for nearly 8% of total global carbon emissions. Excuse me, and this doesn't account for the future predicted growth of the global construction market. So unless we do something, excuse me, to decarbonize construction, then actually those carbon emissions are going to become even more unsustainable than they currently are. So therefore there is a problem, and construction can be a significant part of the problem, or it can be part of the solution. So in the next part of the webinar, I'm going to cover why should you be interested, what does green construction look like, and what can you do about it. So why? There's lots of different reasons. There's business opportunities coming from decarbonisation. Effective decarbonisation will require new products and will require new services. A lot of those services, interestingly, are value added. So engineering and consultancy and digital transformation and innovation, research and development, links to further education. I think in Lincolnshire you have a bit of an issue similar to us up Northumberland way, where actually there are the limitations of geography. For us, we're more distant from the centre. I think your transport links to the centre are probably not brilliant. But actually those things, the reason I like them is because they're less geographically dependent. There's also the community opportunities for local authorities and other people like social landlords, for instance. So there's a huge amount of skills and employability benefits from decarbonisation in terms of building better new build and in terms of decarbonising existing structures. It's very practical work. It's reasonably labour intensive. It is in demand. Demand will absolutely grow. We have to decarbonise that stock. There's no other route for it. And this in turn has an impact on economic resilience. People being skilled and being employed and being employable creates economic resilience in the communities that we want to support. And also there are health and comfort benefits. better health in better quality homes, but also the ability to heat a home comfortably at reasonable cost, which again then creates financial resilience because you're not paying out so much on bills. Housing and quality of place, which Vanessa touched on, are really interesting to me. I think you have, I did read your local plan, the housing growth. I think is it 14,000 homes or something, but it's quite a considerable amount. There are links there with talent attraction and retention, who wants to stay in Lincolnshire and where they stay and how they feel about their communities, how they want to come to Lincolnshire and live and invest. But there's also really strong links with the levelling up agenda. There's a link there to an Economist article that goes into much more depth. But given your swathe of Conservative MPs and the need to articulate what levelling up means and to translate that into practical investment, I think you've got a really good discussion there that could be had as well. And finally, leadership and reputation. Juliet mentioned the role of external investment into Lincolnshire. And I personally tend to think that leadership and reputation do mean that it's much easier to attract people with whom you want to have conversations. But also there's a really significant thing which we'll cover slightly further on about the narrative with government and shifting that to something much more focused on value and outcome rather than cost and regulation. But I would argue this is a cultural rather than a technical challenge. And some of the questions we had, this isn't a criticism of questions, touched on that technical element. The rest of my slides are largely focused on housing, but really that's shorthand for housing outcomes. And by that, I mean better communities. It is necessarily a bit generic because I'm not massively familiar with Lincolnshire, and you are one of the few people I've ever spoken to that have mentioned county farms. So, but certainly the principles behind outcomes apply to whatever your county situation is, I would argue. Why do I say it's cultural rather than technical? Well, broadly, we know what the technical side is going to look like. We know new technologies will emerge, but a lot of the ones that will get better are already there and are reasonably familiar. The grid will become increasingly decarbonised, which means we might need to switch the conversation from carbon much more to affordability of comfort. Fabric first is a well-tried technology, or well-tried manner of building. Decarbonised homes are going to be fabric first in one form or another, and technical solutions will integrate and will have to integrate with the fabric. And then there's issues around livability and usability. We're talking about slightly different types of houses and slightly different building services systems that people have to become familiar with, but they will become familiar with those over time. One of the biggest cultural issues for me is this perception of cost uplift. If you start thinking about better homes and better places from a whole life cost point of view, there is not really a cost uplift there, but cost uplift is often used to shut down the debate about what better could look like. When we were doing the planning for this, we were talking about ambition for Lincolnshire and Lincolnshire wanting to be at the forefront. And it's that cost uplift thinking that will stop you doing something with that ambition and will keep you very much in I would argue, tired and familiar ground. I would also argue there's a benefit to holistic outcomes. Health, for example. There is an issue, and that is not always the case that people who make the capital input necessarily then benefit from the outcome, but certainly in terms of local authorities, social landlords, the LEPs, holistic outcomes should be within what you wish to deliver. They should form part of how you understand the value of your investment. The biggest cost to me that I see is investment in skills and capacity and capability. But these are actually investments in your ability to change and do something different and be ambitious. I would argue in some cases they are actually an investment in due diligence. And I keep saying this again and again, building something that doesn't break the law at lowest cost is not a challenge and it's not an outcome. It's easy to do, but it isn't ambition. It isn't being at the forefront. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but that is the default position of a lot of clients in construction. And that's a narrative, a default position you're going to have to work hard to change, I would suspect. I want to cover some examples in practice, some not too far away from you. Go for Norwich first. Norwich, this affordable housing development, won the Goldsmith Prize, which is a fantastic achievement in 2019. But actually, that was actually part of a much longer journey, starting with supply chain collaboration, understanding what the skills pipeline looked like, and with the City Council being very clear about its ambition and about its scale. It built this place in partnership with the supply chain, the Fabric First Institute. The picture doesn't really do it justice, but this was a house that trainees could go and play with, and they could play with it with tools and equipment and thermal imaging cameras. They were there to find faults, they were there to damage it and see what the impact was. Really exciting stuff, but it started a considerable time ago. There was quite a long lead in to being successful. That's also picked here. You can see in the red circle the ambition to build 1,000 passive houses in 10 years. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about ambition and visibility of work. The fact that the council made that commitment was what got the supply chain to participate and buy in. Exeter, some really, I think, beautiful looking housing, personally. I'm not going to go through these in great detail. I'm very happy to share these slides, but there's lots of things they did to change the nature of business as usual. Their thinking around value for money was very different and very long term. They also make a lot of use of external consultants, and they will admit that that imposes cost, but it does reduce risk, it reduces variations, and it means the implementation becomes much more effective. There's an interesting quote there from Emma Osmondson: an informed client that can effectively control value is how they see themselves. And that's why they make those early stage investments, why they front load that work at the stage where they have the most ability to influence cost. Energy Strong is really exciting. It's a retrofit program, net zero carbon. Nottingham attracted ERDF part funding for this. 10 homes have been completed. The next phase is much, much more ambitious. I really like Energy Strong because it's a performance outcome contract. And that means that Nottingham City Council, or Nottingham City Homes rather, are buying a certain amount of power, a certain level of thermal comfort in those homes, and a certain amount of hot water for 30 years. And as I keep saying, I don't care whether you have to paint the home in custard to achieve that. It's those outcomes that are really, really exciting, because the supply chain has an incentive to invest. It can see 30 years ahead. It can make those investments in quality and in skills. So this is why I say it creates an enormous incentive to make sure these things are delivered consistently for 30 years. That's really exciting. Which brings us to a quote from David Adams. Melius Homes, one of the main contractors on Energy Strong in Nottingham. And he makes this distinction between things which are done well against things which are well intentioned. And I think it's a really important distinction. So I'm starting to come to the end now. So what can we take away? I have had this conversation when I was working directly on client side over and over again. So this is me in the blue. We need to build better. To achieve what we say we're going to, we need to build better. And so my colleagues say, we can't build better. I say, well, why can't we build better? And they say, because it'll cost more. And I say, well, how do you know it will cost more? And they say, because we asked the developer and they said it'll cost more. You need to be out of that space. But that means you need to build an alternative position that is much more sophisticated. I capture it as client leadership. This is my idea, my vision of client leadership. Yours might look very different, or it might pick up some points, but not others. But I think I would argue you need to have a client leadership position that you can articulate and you can build your culture around. It isn't a challenge of gap funding. We frequently see this. We have X many homes. It will cost about 20,000 quid per home. Therefore, people do the maths and they come out with these enormous figures. And they're doing this at a time when our debt has just topped 100% for the first time in 60 odd years. I'm quite worried about that personally. But as a practical outcome, it does mean that the government are not having that conversation. They are almost entirely focused on value and outcome in a way that often isn't appreciated. If you get these slides, these graphics that I've shown link to the documents that are sitting behind them. But Transforming Infrastructure Performance was from 2017. The construction sector deal was also 2017. And these are starting now to translate via the Construction Innovation Hub into the Value Toolkit, which is the circular graphic, which you can use those links to access. But this Value Toolkit is all about how do you understand value? How do you measure it? How do you attach a cost to it so you know what the investment is? How do you know when the outcomes are expressing themselves? How do you know the value of those outcomes? But it means you can have a much more sophisticated conversation about what value is and why you are investing. I would urge all clients to go through a process similar to this, if only because most people tend to get the ask a government bit and shove that to the front. I think if you are being ambitious, if you want to be at the forefront, you have to go through this quite rigorous self-questioning. What's really interesting to me is the way that you describe Team Lincolnshire and Business Lincolnshire, and the way you describe the partnership between the public bodies and the business bodies. And that seems very collaborative. It seems a lot more collaborative than many other people I spoke to. And I think that gives you a fantastic starting point to have this conversation. Nobody ever got millions of pounds by asking for millions of pounds, but this is the sort of government, this is the sort of conversation the government want to have. What does transformation look like? Are you clear on it? And are you clear what assistance you need to pull the levers? I won't go through this in great detail. This was the asterisk from the previous slide. This is my take on it. Government is going to be very distracted. Value and outcome are much more embedded, especially within the Treasury, than is often believed. And governments are desperate for a sensible and mature conversation about value and outcome. So please don't join the regulation and subsidy queue. It's very long, it's not moving very fast, and there is another way. I love this quote from Mark Shaler: average has a long half-life. This refers to business as usual. If it's plodding along, if it's not disastrous, it will tend to plod along. But especially when you come to built environment and built environment outcomes, you have to be much more questioning. You have to be wary of what is sanctioned by familiarity. People often refer to things like building regulations and traditional brick and block housing as tried and tested. But is it really? I would ask. Very, very few clients actually measure the outcomes of what they build, actually really understand it. And you can't have a sensible conversation about built environment outcomes and traditional housing and modern methods of construction unless you understand how you're going to measure what you actually do. And that's a real challenge for most clients. And I love this quote as well from Max McEwen: experience does not equal learning. You can be stupid for a very long time. So there's real challenges there if you are ambitious and you want to be at the forefront. There's real, I'm not saying you are stupid, please don't get me wrong, but there are very real challenges to how you think through your current culture. So the future of green construction was the question. I think in terms of all those things we looked at global cement production, for instance, there's a number of existing considerations, but actually there's only a limited amount of those that you can influence, but you can do quite a lot with the ones that you can influence. And the one I want to pick up due to time really is client leadership. So what is client leadership? To me, client leadership is the key to unlocking ambition, unlocking what it means to be at the forefront. It's got a cultural element, so that's about how you procure value-based outcomes and take long-term decisions, how you do your clienting in an active and sophisticated way, rather than defaulting to regulation or using transactional relationships with your supply chain, and learning loops. Learning loops are absolutely critical. Procuring for value is the old name for the value toolkit, but you have to understand value. You have to have the capability to do this and to maintain intent. There is no reason why a good quality, ambitious project should be distorted during the tender progress or at procurement stage or by the supply chain. But maintaining intent is actually a skilled and I think culturally significant thing to do. And finally, value structures. I could talk about all of this for much longer, but value structures, the elements you very deliberately put in place. So tried and trusted as an example. Well, do you do post-occupancy monitoring and evaluation to understand what is tried and trusted? That's an example of a value structure. your technical teams should be obsessed with value, outcome, quality, performance, and risk. That's a value structure. So this takes us back to understanding what your client leadership looks like, what the sort of basic level of content is. A couple of quotes to finish. I love this one from Frank Tiger. Your future depends on many things, but mostly on you. And finally, don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value, from our presidential candidate at the moment. And I think that puts us on to questions and answers.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Tom. It's a really interesting point there, and a lot to consider going forward. So David, can I hand over to you now for any questions that have come through?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. So while you're talking, questions have come through. I'll address the first one that came in. So when you were talking about, I guess, skills, but how important is training and developing staff to help continue to grow the low carbon sector?
I think it's really important, but I think the most important thing to do is understand your ambition. To be ambitious, you don't necessarily need to be at the forefront. You don't need to be better than everyone else. You just need to understand what your motivations and drivers are, and how your culture sits with them. I think there's an element of leadership needing to understand how ambitious it wants to be and being realistic about that. Because actually how you train and motivate staff comes a bit further down the line. Assuming that your ambition is to go for much lower carbon Lincolnshire than it currently is, then you will move very swiftly on to that staff engagement and that skills and training component. But what's really interesting to me is the Fabric First Institute is a really good example where there was that clarity around clarity and honesty around what the skills gap is. The Fabric First Institute was built by the supply chain. The supply chain largely built it and provided all of the materials that went into that building. And that's what you can do when you have the supply chain on board. And also, if that's the atmosphere in what you're working, I would argue it's much easier to get staff on board as well. You've got something there that's quite exciting. They can see a direction of travel. They can see a point to it, and they can help you articulate what the skills gaps are as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, just considering you were talking about Fabric First, one of the questions that have come in. So regarding the principles of Fabric First, are we at risk of over-insulating buildings, either dwellings or commercial buildings that are little or that are very little or no? Sorry, let me rephrase that again. With the Fabric First principles to mind, are we at risk of over-insulating buildings, either dwellings or commercial buildings, for very little or no environmental gain, thereby creating an unsustainable approach?
There's two slightly different questions there, and one is in terms of Fabric First. To decarbonize buildings, you'd either have to build new dwellings that consume very little energy, and you'll have to retrofit existing dwellings, so they also consume very little energy. And both of those things are very risky. The only route to do it effectively is air tightness, which is why Fabric First is the building principle that gives you air tightness. But what people tend to do is use regulatory standards as their risk management, and regulatory standards aren't there to do that. Building regs is good in some areas, it's weaker in others. It's not fantastic in terms of air, in terms of ventilation, but it's not meant to be fantastic in terms of ventilation. There is the onus on the client that is commissioning a building to understand the standard to which they want to build it and how it is likely to perform and where the risks are. So it's not Fabric First in itself that is a risk. It is often the client capability and their ability to engage with their supply chain in terms of risk and how those are understood and mitigated that's the problem. And quite often, energy efficient buildings take the bullet for what is really poor design and poor practice. And then there was a second part to your question. I think that was about the technologies invested in Fabric First. I think, again, that comes down to what you do, how you manage it at a local level. So Exeter are quite interesting in terms of the range of skills they rely on externally and the range of skills they've built up internally. And that means you can have quite a dynamic conversation in terms of developments about what sort of standard that needs to be built to. I think quite often we reach for a particular standard. So Passive House is mentioned. Quite often, certainly in the housing press, you will see constant calls for the government to tell people to what standard to build. And I think that's a bit of a false argument. It's about understanding what standard is suitable for the location and the occupants and your budget, and then working the technology around that in a competent way. So good clienting reduces risk, I think, is the fundamental point.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Couple more questions. And so throughout your talk, you had plenty of examples, some fantastic examples from around the UK. But in this question, they say there's a few led by Lincolnshire. So in terms of the examples that you discussed and the projects that were there, who needs to lead on this within the, say, the Lincolnshire context in order to achieve those sort of examples or project outcomes?
I suffer a bit from not knowing Lincolnshire very well, so I'm sorry about that. But in terms of leadership, I think it is a coalition of the willing. I think within that willing, you have to have the county council because of its weight and coverage. You have to have the LEPs, and I suspect the fact that you have people on this webinar who are from the private sector means they must be interested in the content at some level. You will also have local networks. You will have some, I suspect you have a Constructing Excellence network, for example. Excuse me. We have Constructing Excellence Northeast up here, and they're a very good convener. So I suspect it's a case of you will be able to identify better than me who is able to understand that landscape and who sits in that landscape. And then I would suggest it's a case of convening those parties. And it might be that Business Lincolnshire is a good convener for that. It doesn't have to be a specific or new way to do it. It's much more important to understand who you have in the room and how you're going to collaborate and communicate.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we get more questions coming in through. I'll just address a couple more, and then we'll move on with the case study, and then we can come back to any questions that aren't answered. So okay, so do you think that a review of domestic fuel taxation would be a helpful measure in supporting demand for higher efficiency homes? Currently, domestic fuel is taxed at 5% VAT, where energy saving measures are often taxed at 20% VAT.
I'm not personally convinced it's the biggest issue to tackle first. Most people buy a house on depending on the location, depending on schools, transport networks, etc., etc. When you look at energy efficiency, the cost of running the house, that's much further down the list. And also, most people think, last time I looked at it, the average occupancy of a home for an owner occupier anyway was about 7 years. So even if you reduce taxation on refurbishment measures from 20% to a much lower level, the payback is still likely to be more than 7 years. So I'm not saying necessarily it's not a good thing to do. I'm not convinced it's the biggest priority.
Brilliant, thank you. And you did touch on it, and there's also a question I guess I was interested in as well. I mean, we talked about the building regulations and in terms of passive housing, and you kind of briefly touched on it, but just a sort of a general question. I mean, do we really need to wait for regulation to change? Do we need that policy drive in order to make the changes, or is it a case of as businesses and as I should say ambitious people coming together, can we drive for the step change rather than waiting for policy to lead it?
Well, it depends a bit on who you're talking to, because there are some people in the marketplace who are dependent on regulation because of the way the land market works. But this is why you absolutely need social landlords and local authorities in the room, because they have enough scale and they operate over the long term. And I would argue they are able to determine their ambition locally, independent of regulation. Even if regulation is quite stretching, it's not going to be at passive house level, for argument's sake. I'm not suggesting your local ambition should be passive house, but you could you could organise or agree between you what a suitably ambitious level of decarbonisation or retrofit or new build standard look like. And I do find it immensely frustrating that we have, to me, it's been apparent for a decade that we are going to have to decarbonise homes, and we are still having the same conversation we had in 2010. So yes, I think you're right. Those people, when they're convening, that should be one of the things they're discussing. What is a suitable, ambitious target that we can work towards, independent of regulation? And also, another point I was making was about value and outcome. I think you need to shift to a value and outcome culture, so you can do this well and you can do it safely. But it does open up a different conversation with government. I think a much more productive conversation with government. And so there is a virtue in being ambitious and independent, because it enables you to have a better conversation with those influencers. So yes, I personally don't see there's any particular great. I think waiting for regulation is a bit of a way of kicking the can down the road. We know where we're heading. There's much we can do to get on with it.
Fantastic, thank you, Tom. There are still a few more questions, but just conscious of time. So what we'll do is thank you very much, Tom, for the presentation and for answering those. We'll come back to the rest of the questions later on, but I think if we just continue now with the case study. So continue to put the questions in, and we'll get back to you when we can at the end.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, David and Tom. Thank you for those interesting questions you're sending through too. Please do continue to put your questions through to us on the question pane of the control panel. And now I'll pass over to Tim Clement so he can give us some detail about the case study project they've been working on. Thank you, Tim.
Great. I hope you can see the screen and, less importantly, see me. I'm going to talk for just about 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the most, about this project we delivered about 4 years ago. So just briefly about myself, I work for Morgan Sindall. I have done for over 10 years, mainly in design management, but alongside that, more recently, working on carbon strategy with the group. So the idea of this case study is to say a little bit about making it happen in practice, low carbon building, what we learned, and what it might mean for you. So when I saw the list of companies registered for today, I thought, wow, that covers pretty much every stakeholder in a construction project and beyond. Product specialists, construction firms, developers, private clients, local authorities, stakeholders, and designers and consultants of all kinds. So I'll try and make it relevant for everybody as best as I can, but I think the best thing is just to take you through what it was and what we learned. So with terminology around such as low carbon construction, embodied carbon, net zero carbon suddenly entering the general consciousness, many are asking how this works in practice, and there are really two problems to solve here. One is, how do we accurately measure it? And the other one is, how do we reduce it, at least from a construction point of view? And yeah, I'm not going to directly answer those, but hopefully over the course of the next 10 minutes, there'll be something useful here for you. So this was 4 years ago we delivered this. A lot's happened in 4 years, but we're still learning from this project in terms of how to apply a zero carbon thinking on new projects. So there we go. That's what it looks like. And although it's first thing I'll say, because it's quite easy to actually criticize a building like this, it is a showcase sustainable building, but there's a lot that we can learn from that in terms of a more typical building. GSK were the main funder and it was built at the University of Nottingham. So as a project overview, GSK started this project almost as an experiment without the University of Nottingham to begin with, and the experiment was essentially, can you build a lab that's carbon neutral and also naturally ventilated? So the specific site wasn't so important, just the ability to demonstrate that it's possible. So the brief was over a 25-year study period. We'd look at, can it be carbon neutral in that time, over 25 years? Clearly, the way to make that happen in terms of the construction, oh, I should say carbon neutral means it pays off the carbon used to put it together, the materials, the construction impact, etc., and the replacement parts over 25 years, which means it has to operate carbon negative. Already easy to criticize that, but yeah, let me explain the project. So timber was clearly a big part of that, making everything out of wood as far as possible to lock the carbon in and just reduce it upfront carbon as much as possible to give us the best chance of achieving zero carbon. Because obviously at the beginning of the job you need to make structural decisions, but you don't already know the finer details when the design's fully developed of how the energy model is going to perform. So you really needed on this project to cut the embodied carbon as far as you physically could within the limits of the project brief to give ourselves the best chance. So the primary objective was sustainability. So we kind of, as a design team, it was a great opportunity to have free rein to make it work, find different products, different ways of doing things. Just to make it more difficult, we also had BREEAM Outstanding to achieve, and its US counterpart LEED Platinum to achieve. So immediately at the beginning, everyone was worried about these different things coming into conflict, not being able to achieve them all. But really, when it came down to it, there wasn't much conflict between them. They were quite compatible, and we did achieve them. And LEED was actually a great addition to that because it drove us to ask deeper questions of the supply chain. For example, where do the raw materials come from? Not something really that BREEAM asks, sort of empirically to work that out, but LEED certainly does. So supply chain, I've heard it said quite a lot in contracting circles that we as contractors don't have influence over the design. It is with the clients to reduce the carbon impact of a building. We've got no influence. We can't do anything about it. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but I think you know what I mean. And this project proved that's absolutely not true when the supply chain are engaged. That's something Tom mentioned as well in his presentation, or in answer to one of the questions. One of the things we did right at the start in that short period between contract award and starting on site, we changed the foundation solution. So supply chain partner came to us and said, you know, can we look at the possibility of doing vibrated stone columns rather than concrete piles? The ground condition is pretty bad. It was an old rally bicycle site on Triumph Road in Nottingham. So piled solution, industry standard, normal thing to do, down to the rock. And these guys came along and said, we want to try this out. And there were issues with design PI and things that we had to iron out. And ultimately we did it. And we went from almost 100 tons of carbon, would have been the concrete piles, down to just 6. And that was mainly the transport from the quarry to the building, because quarrying stone, carbon-wise, it's almost nothing. Virgin material. I mean, recycled aggregates would have been a much higher carbon impact because of the distance for a suitable material, which was at that time the nearest one was Wales to Nottingham. So that was one example of where the supply chain really made an impact, but it was a learning curve as well. So when we started to get into the details of the building, we tried to reduce carbon wherever we could, and sometimes that took us out of our comfort zone and the design team out of their comfort zone in terms of tried and tested methodologies. So one thing was the floor here, all the upper floors, we wanted to build it as a floating floor. So essentially that's insulation with an OSB board on top we wanted to do, but not fixed down. It floats and it's kind of self-supporting, much lower carbon, not many materials, and it's underfloor heating as well within that. It wasn't tested structurally, so to get around that, we built it in Imperial College London. I think it cost us about £5,000 or something to do that, and we load tested this build-up that hadn't been done before, and it passed, and we could use it. Then when we got to site, the flooring contractor said, "I'm not putting my floor finish down on the OSB board because the manufacturer of the glue of the floor finish would not warrant putting it down on OSB because that wasn't tested." But we'd run out of time at that point, so we had to put an extra layer of ply. It was only 6mm, but with loads of fixings, just so we could put the floor finish down. So you try and work something through, and then another curveball comes along. But again, it had to be ply, and we didn't want to rip anything up. We didn't want to waste any material. That was always at the forefront. You can also see here there's this service boom. So all the ventilation and power and data and lighting is all fed off this boom. And that was engineered completely out of plywood. So there was only a little metal basket for the data and power containment to keep that separate. In fact, that was wood as well in the end as well. So all out of wood, but very difficult. When it rained, there was some moisture and we hadn't quite finished the building. We had problems with a couple delaminating and we had to address that. So having everything out of wood and acclimatizing the wood in the building and making sure none of it gets wet was a real challenge in the building. Clearly we overcame it, but something we definitely bear in mind for future time. And one other thing I'd mention in terms of learning curve was these walls. So cross-laminated timber was main structural form of the walls in between glued laminated beams and columns. And the finish of the walls here that you can just about see where my mouse pointer is, that's how it came from the factory to the site and erected. All we did was put a surface spread of flame clear coating on it, and that was it. No additional finish. But there was a bit of a worry, wet chemistry, spilling different chemicals. How's that going to react with this coating? Leaving a Bunsen burner against it, is it going to just catch light? So we got some blocks of cross-laminated timber. We coated it with the different products that we could find for surface spread of flame, and they took it to their chemistry lab and chucked a load of stuff all over it. And we chose one that performed really well. Actually, you could just sand it off, recoat it, and there wasn't even a stain. So there were ways to overcome what would have been perhaps a showstopper in another environment. On the negative side, because it's not always a positive journey, there are a couple of supply chain members, I won't mention which parts in particular, that were just reluctant to get involved in providing the carbon footprint of their materials. I just don't think they were in that place. Others were further forwards. We started in 2013. Others were further forwards, and some just didn't have the resource or just weren't in that place to support that. So we did struggle to get some materials, and when we look at this, I've just got a couple of slides left. Was it really whole life thinking? It's a question that came to my mind when I was preparing for this webinar. Was it really whole life thinking? So it paid back actually in 11 years or so. You can see on that graph, that red line is the carbon balance. When it goes below 0, that means it's carbon negative, it's paid back. And yeah, I can explain in a bit more detail what the scope was and the boundaries and how that was all achieved in terms of building services. But I won't, for the sake of time just now. But what it does show is that there were some issues with this, but it was definitely pushing the boat out in terms of whole life thinking at the time. So now looking in hindsight, there are a few things that we can pick up on. I mentioned a couple briefly, but at the time it really did represent much more whole life thinking than was typical. So paying back in 11 years was an issue. So contractually, it wasn't an issue. It was great. It was great result, actually, a great outcome. Contractually, we had to pay back in 25 years. So when you look at this graph, we could have spent an extra 900 tons of carbon up front. We could have done quite easily, and we would have still achieved the contractual objective. So that's almost a dangerous position to be in. You're kind of relying on the values or the good nature of the team not to do that, because it's against the principles of the project, but contractually we could. So one for the future: always set an embodied carbon target, not just a whole life target. And the other one was there was a combined heating and power unit, a boiler, CHP boiler, in the building, and it exports heat, and it's heat led, which means when there's a heat in demand, it runs and generates power at the same time. So we had a CHP with a very low carbon fuel, much lower carbon than the electricity that we were importing from the grid at the time, which has since decarbonized significantly. What that means is when it runs more, the carbon balance is better. So when the CHP runs more, the carbon balance is better. So theoretically, if you think that through, if you took half the insulation out of the walls, the CHP would run more in autumn and spring, and there'd be a better carbon impact. Obviously, totally counterintuitive and totally against principles of what is really the foundational principle of sustainable design, which is consume less, whether that's energy or fuel or materials. It's consume less. That's the absolute. I mean, we took all the ceilings out of this project because we realized, hey, you don't need ceilings. They're not performing any function in this building. Let's just take them out. Consume less. So that's another one to think about, and where fabric first is quite important. So really, embodied carbon should be a focus there as well, as the main point there. So since the GSK project, all this has happened. RICS brought out an assessment methodology for buildings, which is mandatory for RICS members. That's still working its way through building contracts that have that relevant. UK GBC have brought out their net zero framework definition, which is quite clear, and I think there's a general consensus in construction firms to support that. And then these two here are really target setting challenges: the REBA 2030 challenge and the LETI challenge. The LETI is more onerous in terms of embodied carbon, but in other areas they're compatible. And they focus on an embodied carbon target and an operational target. So separate targets, so we don't have the same issue we had at unit, or potential issue at University of Nottingham. And finally, I just want to mention this. There's been a paradigm shift, and I guess Tom kind of touched on this as well, but we're seeing in terms of the clients we're speaking to, now this is really being driven now at a corporate level. It's something we didn't expect a few years ago. Everyone was saying regulation has to come first to motivate change, and we're actually seeing it coming from a corporate level. So two things, and I'm finishing on this, is the science-based targets for corporate action. We signed up as well. We were the first construction firm in the UK to have their targets approved, which basically means we're going to take responsibility now for our supply chain emissions and the building and operation. And why not? We're in the central position within the value chain. We can gather and act upon that data and provide meaningful data to clients to make informed decisions. And the other one is the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So that's now supported by over 1,000 organizations, and I think the number I saw somewhere was that they are responsible for more than 100 trillion pounds worth of assets, the organizations that have signed up to this, that are putting climate change as a risk high on their agenda when they're funding assets. And in terms of a paradigm shift, and the reason I use those words is we're now seeing the industry moving from a green version of business as usual to a concerted effort to develop within the limits of the global ecosystem. So that's a really exciting place to be. And if I could just summarize a couple of points. One is the supply chain has to be engaged. Really, consume less has to be the foundational principle, which requires a challenge to the status quo, as Tom mentioned. We need to talk about whole life carbon and set limits to embodied carbon along with that to achieve these aspirations. So that's it from me. I think that's Q&A for everybody now.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Tim. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us there. Really interesting to hear about your journey and the lessons learned. So I'll now pass over to David again, just to see, this is an opportunity now for any questions for Tim, and then if there's any final burning questions that anyone would like to ask Vanessa or Tom, then please do. A reminder, you can put those questions in to us through the question pane in your control panel, or if you wish to ask a question, please click the raise your hand button that's located on the control panel, and we will unmute your mic so we can all hear you. So I'll pass over to David now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you, Juliet. Brilliant. Yeah, so one of the questions that came in for you, Tim, so how did the operational energy demand of the building perform compared to the designed calculations?
Okay, great question. Obviously, not as well. The well-documented performance gap is there. What we tried to address on the project was the perception gap, which is essentially the fact that the building regs output is not a prediction of energy performance, and sometimes that's a wake-up call for some. So we tried to model the actual operation, but you never know until the client buys the equipment or the final equipment and how the building's used, because this didn't follow on from, they weren't moving from one building to another, so we didn't know, let's say, the specific equipment they were bringing in at the beginning, and yeah, there was a drop in performance. I think the PVs performed pretty much as anticipated in terms of the payback. There were some teething issues with the CHP because of the low carbon fuel and getting that to fire on all cylinders, literally, I think. But generally, I think it had the same issue as many buildings, which was that the equipment and occupancy patterns, we really need to have this continuous improvement cycle where we do post-occupancy evaluations, then act on it. University of Nottingham are quite good at that. They publish all of theirs on the internet. You can just go and download them. But yeah, I think that maybe, yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, brilliant. And just on, I mean, you started covering it nicely, and the question continues. So obviously, once you realise the gap, what were the learnings? What learnings were achieved from that understanding?
Yeah, so the building is a mainly for postgrad research. So I know that I don't know the outcome to that, so I can't really answer the question directly. But I know that there are postgrad researchers working on exactly that in the building, and working with the building users and trying to understand. So as a building, that is really a hub for that happening. But in terms of other buildings, would you have a postgrad sitting there doing that work? I'm not sure, but there's definitely that needs to happen, because without that final part in the loop, then you don't get those learnings that you can pass on.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Sorry, just going through them. And then in terms of practicality, so obviously the building was a showcase building, but in terms of practicality, I mean, how easy would it be to duplicate the build on a sort of a larger aspect, a larger scale?
So in terms of university buildings, the idea was that it should be a scalable thing. It was well documented throughout the process so that it could be mimicked on another project. I think what we've learned since then, is that the methodology could have a little bit of improvement, and I point more towards the REBA 2030 Climate Challenge as something to start off with in terms of achieving it in practice now with what's been learned in the last few years. They set some quite realistic targets. Their 2030 targets are quite realistic to achieve in embodied carbon. They set a space heating demand target and a few others. And you can also look to LETI as well for that. So I think that would be the place to start to in the real world on, say, a primary school or a secondary school to or housing development to actually have low carbon outcomes, realistic ones.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. And just one last question, again on the same similar sort of line, but just more around costs. So, given the building and the specification, how much more did the building cost than, say, a standard university building or of a similar design?
Great question. It did cost more, not that much more. So I guess it's comes back to that question of what do you value, and clients will pay for that. So we also delivered another project for the University of Birmingham more recently, and if you apply inflation to it, I think the difference was about, in build cost, £500 a metre squared. So one was Nottingham was about 3,500 a metre squared. It's very rough figures, so if anyone's listening from Morgan Stanley, will not share anything commercially sensitive. And the other one was about 3,000 a metre squared. So it was a little bit more, but then when you look at something like the REBA challenge or the LETI challenge, you know, to get that last bit, that carbon neutrality, you're actually probably having to invest more to get there.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So we have some other questions. I'm just going to open this up more to the rest of the panel. So let me just go through. So probably a question for Vanessa, although maybe one that you could look at, Tom, as well afterwards. So is there enough emphasis on decarbonisation in the government's proposed planning reforms contained in its consultation planning for the future?
Oh gosh, now that is a good question. I think the easy answer is to say no, but I suppose at the moment the position we're in is going through all of those 26 questions of the consultation response and working in things like this agenda into them very strongly. And this is it's sort of the start of a process, isn't it? But I think Tom probably alluded to it, there's almost a groundswell locally. Certainly in Lincolnshire, there's a real appetite for this agenda. And I think we will be pushing that very strongly. Brilliant,
thank you. Okay. And I guess maybe still coming back to you, Vanessa. So how does retrofitting fit into the low carbon future? And I guess, does the Green Homes grants, both the voucher scheme and the LAD scheme, go far enough in addressing the problem with current housing stock?
So I think retrofitting is part of the challenge we've got to get better at, I suppose, would be my take. I think we have lots of challenges, particularly as a kind of rural county, to address, and we've touched on decarbonisation of housing, but particularly the electrification of the heating grid. Many parts of our county are kind of really dependent on oil. We have all those kind of complex issues to deal with. And we need to make sure that we take account of sort of social impacts of some of the decisions that we make as well. So I think that kind of wide support for that whole agenda is really important. And we can't lose sight of that for it's always a little bit more exciting, isn't it, to talk about new build than it is to talk about retrofit. But I think it needs to be a greater emphasis really for us.
Okay, can I just open that same question up to Tom as well, and just in terms of your opinion on that as well?
Yeah, what's really interesting to me is the links between the skills you need for low carbon new build or much more energy efficient new build, and the skills you need for retrofit. So as both of them get more energy efficient, they both get riskier. And you can put in learning and structures for new build, which are easier to develop those capabilities and the skills. But then when it comes to retrofit, you just deepen those skills. So actually, there's a very strong connection between the two in terms of how skills operate, and this is where the employability thing is really interesting for me, and I think has got a lot of potential. That brings us partly back to the question about the Green Homes Grant and things like that. Those schemes aren't particularly ambitious, but they're probably as ambitious as we need to be, given the lack of a skilled supply chain. It's hard to stress how risky retrofit can be, and you don't need to Google search very far to come across some awful examples that have made properties much, much worse and have actually put people's health in quite severe danger. So we have a very poor supply chain for retrofit. And if we use regulation and grant to drive what's happening, then we're going to encounter that skills gap and put in poor quality work and get poor quality outcomes. But that's the interesting thing for me, is that the point where those new build and those retrofit skills join.
Thanks, Tom. Just sorry, I've got family coming back from school, so if you hear a bit of noise in the background, it's just the joys of working at home. A question for Tim that's come up. So within your talk, you mentioned perception as a value metric. So has a post-occupancy evaluation been done with regards to the building's comfort or usability, and what have the results been?
Yeah, so I don't actually know. But what I do know is, so the University of Nottingham had a standard format post-occupancy evaluation, and they definitely took comfort into account, thermal comfort. Did the occupant feel the need to turn it up? Was there disagreement in the cellular office space about some were too hot, some were too cold? So that definitely came into it. But I don't want to guess at the answer to that question, what the actual results were for University of Nottingham, because I think it's a bit unique there that it's an ongoing thing, and if it's someone's doctorate, they might not, they might be keeping that information until they've finished. So it's unique from that point of view. So sorry, I can't give a better answer.
No, it's fine. I guess it's a case of just watch the space and see what comes out of the study afterwards. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so just given time, one more question. It's a question for you, Vanessa. So, I mean, one of the questions that came in a bit earlier was around 7,000 new homes being proposed on the edges of Lincoln City. So the City of Lincoln Council's pledged target carbon neutrality by 2030. The County Council's target aligns with national government policy by 2050. How does the council envisage that these additional developments will help towards achieving zero carbon operation by 2050?
So I think this is a really good example of what we've been talking about this afternoon, isn't it? About really seizing the opportunity to plan developments early, and to work with developers to really inform kind of decisions that are made about those sites. So people who know a bit more detail about those sustainable urban extensions will know that that's part of the conversations that are regularly happening. So how can we build in lots of aspects of sustainability into the kind of the master planning work that's done, and whether that's housing design or whether that's the layout of the sites, or about movement decisions that people will then be able to take when they live there, and also how can we improve kind of opportunities for our residents who are there at the moment. So could we bring in new facilities and opportunities? I don't actually see the fact that we have differing dates as being particularly challenging. I think it's to be expected when you work in partnership. You're not. It's about finding kind of a common thread, isn't it? So the fact that the city are striving for that 2030 date, I think we will be happy to see kind of ambitious projects come forward earlier. Certainly our targets, we will not be leaving everything until towards the end of 2050. We've been very proactive in using science-based targeting to understand kind of where we need to be on that trajectory. So kind of earlier work is certainly better for us. I think just in terms of impacts, I would touch on particularly some of the movement challenges around the city is as a strong an issue in terms of sustainability and carbon as some of the built issues as well. So yes, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Just in terms of conference time, I think that's, to be honest, that's all the questions that we sort of come in through. There might be a couple more, but we'll go through those and we'll address them to individuals where we haven't asked you questions. But thank you very much again to you three for taking us through those.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much. And that brings us to the end of the session. But should you wish to continue the discussion or provide further comments, please do that via the email teamlincolnshire@lincolnshire.gov.uk. We're really pleased to see those. I would now just like to thank our presenters Vanessa, Tom and Tim for sharing their insights with us today. And also thank you to David as well for helping with the facilitation of the Q&A sessions. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for attending today and for getting involved and asking so many questions and making comments. It's really good to receive that all from you. Just to let you know that once you leave the session, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate it if you would take the time to complete that and provide your feedback, including any suggestions of topics you wish to see delivered in future webinars. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 28 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar should you like to review any of the presentations given today. Please do keep an eye on both the Business Lincolnshire and Team Lincolnshire websites for the latest business updates. If you've not already done so, do subscribe to the weekly newsletter. You can do that via the Business Lincolnshire websites. That's www.businesslincolnshire.com. Of course, also, if you're interested in joining Team Lincolnshire, please visit their website or contact Team Lincolnshire at lincolnshire.gov.uk. Now, our next free webinar will be focusing on the future direction of Team Lincolnshire, its objectives and how our ambassadors can be part of growing and shaping the greater Lincolnshire region. It is exclusive for Team Lincolnshire members and will be taking place on Thursday, the 22nd of October at 2 p.m. Further details will be sent to members shortly with regards to that session. Now, on behalf of Team Lincolnshire, Business Lincolnshire, our presenters Vanessa, Tom and Tim, David, our facilitator, and to you, I'd like to say again, thank you very much for joining us and please do enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you at another session soon. Thank you.